Hello everyone and welcome to today's Mondac webinar in association with Greenberg Traurig, who will be discussing supply chain developments in 2024. My name is Dan Sampaio and I'm joined by a brilliant panel to take us through today's discussion. Laura Siegel-Rabinovitz counsels domestic and multinational businesses on complex supply chain issues and other complicated challenges associated with trade, advising on mitigation of duty exposure and compliance. Laura has deep experience handling international trade projects for multinational importers, exporters, manufacturers, retailers, customs brokers, and freight forwarders in industries such as renewable energy, steel, apparel, consumer products, and industrial equipment, among others. Gabriel Lozano is a shareholder in the Greenberg Mexico City office and as head of the Nearshoring practice group has relocated permanently to Monterrey, Mexico. He focuses his corporate practices on mergers and acquisitions, private equity and venture capital investments, and private financing. As a dually licensed attorney eligible to practice in Mexico and the US, admitted to the NY State Bar, Gabriel has served as a transactional attorney advising clients in connection with domestic as well as cross-border transactions. His cross-border experience includes advising clients in both inbound and outbound venture capital and private equity investments, as well as in their soft landing in Mexico and Latin America, including legal aspects in connection with the relocation of business operations to Mexico. Now, before I hand over to the panel to begin today's webinar, a housekeeping item. You can submit questions to our panel by typing them into the questions pane of the toolbar on the right-hand side of your page. And we do encourage you to get your questions in as we will be fielding them during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. It's now my pleasure to hand you over to Laura and Gabrielle to begin. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan, and welcome everyone. So other than for the most simple of products or commodities, supply chains for most products are complex and vulnerable. And so therefore, companies have realized that they need more control over their supply chain and need transparency and visibility into those supply chains. And so companies have started mapping their supply chains. And of course, European companies are ahead of US companies in this regard. And I'm talking about mapping from tier 1 suppliers to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. And in addition, the geopolitical situation also impacts sourcing decisions. From a US perspective, I would say the most important issue right now is the US-China trade war. And that impacts finished products manufactured in China and also components manufactured in China and exported elsewhere for further manufacturing. As I'm sure all of you know, in July of 2018, President Trump imposed additional tariffs on most products coming from China. It was at 25%. There's a smaller list, an additional 7.5% duty, which is quite significant. And then, of course, the Chinese added their own retaliatory tariffs, and we had a tit for tat between the administrations. And the Biden administration has kept those tariffs in place. There's been no change there. In addition to that, globally, forced labor is a very important issue right now. For US Customs, it is without a doubt the #1 enforcement issue. So, you know, when companies are thinking about their sourcing strategies, it's led to some extent of the anywhere but China. And I would say most of the companies I work with have tried to move something out of China if they can, whether it's a finished product or a component, not 100% of their manufacturing, but certainly some of their manufacturing to other countries. And clearly Vietnam and other Asian countries have been beneficiaries of that move, and Mexico as well. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. Next slide, please. So the EU has ESG regulations in place. We see regulations in the US percolating. Although I did hear in terms of the EU, the latest EU regulations are having some difficulty passing the member states, but there's enough out there and there's certainly shareholder interest and customer interest both in the EU and in the US. So companies are focused on ESG. And again, that harkens back to companies need visibility and transparency into their supply chains. And again, that means companies need to know their suppliers, right? In addition, now there is this focus on sustainability, recycled and organic materials. And I would say companies need to be careful if they're making any public claims about sustainability or saying 100% made with 100% organic materials, any claim, any public claim on their website, because it clearly is a litigation risk. And we have seen in the United States class actions in this regard. So I suggest companies take a top-down approach, looking at their agreements with their vendors, reviewing vendor codes of conduct, editing them. They already should have ESG sections in terms of worker rights, etc. But this is the time that companies are editing those agreements and beefing up DEI sections, women's rights, collective bargaining, those environmental protections. We've also seen standalone restricted substances policies, as many chemicals are now banned, and in the US we have federal and we also have state regulations on that. So companies are drafting standalone restricted substances policies. Of course, public companies are filing their annual reports with regard to ESG already. And all of this is impacting sourcing strategies, right? Companies have to think and are thinking, where is the risk to the company? And again, companies need to know their suppliers, do that due diligence, frequent monitoring and auditing, and it's difficult, and particularly in certain regions, the auditing is complicated. And companies are thinking, what is in their interest? Certainly, if it's a brand, protecting the brand above all else is probably paramount, because we've seen, for example, in the issue of worker rights with the tragedy in Bangladesh, which was now so many years ago, it's a very old lesson of how a tragedy can impact a brand. A few words on carbon. There are a number of proposals in the US Congress now. A number of proposals for a carbon border tax, others to measure carbon emissions, which would impact both domestic and foreign products. I don't think this year, in this election year, we're going to see movement in Congress, but there are numerous proposals. And I do think having CBAM in effect in the EU has reignited this debate in Congress. And also in the United States, we have a number of states with their own carbon legislation. In New York, we have the New York Fashion Act, which was proposed already a couple of years ago, but it's still alive in the New York State Legislature, which would require companies to, again, map carbon emissions. I don't know if it will pass in this election year. Again, it's an open question. California also has carbon legislation. They have recycling regulations that are going into effect, in particular on single-use plastic packaging. We just saw Washington State propose a bill very similar to the New York Fashion Act. So, clearly the carbon legislation targets specific industries, certain products. Steel, cement, iron, aluminum, fertilizer, those are clearly targeted. Real estate and construction, infrastructure also will be impacted if things are passed. And I think from a US perspective, a carbon tax can be looked at, can be seen as another measure to protect domestic industry. We have the additional tariffs on products of China, additional tariffs on steel and aluminum currently, additional tariffs on imported solar modules, all of which have bipartisan support in the US. And there is that anti-China sentiment in the Congress as well. In addition, there's an interest in protecting domestic industry now. And that leads us to nearshoring, which we'll talk about more as well. So I would say, if carbon, like we see with CBAM in the EU, if the carbon legislation does move forward in the US, and I think at some point it will to some extent, companies, again, are going to have to expend additional effort in gaining visibility into their supply chains. And guess what? Supply chains just got more expensive, right? In terms of worker rights, clearly it is the Biden trade policy to focus on worker rights. And I would say it actually, I don't want to say started with, but when the Trump administration renegotiated NAFTA into USMCA, there was also a focus on worker rights. And now the Biden administration is very, very clear, and Biden's US trade representative talks about worker rights, I think, in every speech she gives. So it's clearly very important to the administration. And forced labor, and we'll talk more about forced labor. I mean, that's a global issue. The EU has legislation and other pending legislation. Right now it's focused on China, but it will expand to other parts of the world. I think that's globally, it's going to be expanding. Next slide, please. So, look, let's be clear. No company wants forced labor in their supply chain, right? Full stop. And it has, in fact, been a violation of US law since the 1930s to import goods or components of those goods made with forced labor. And then we have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which focuses on the Xinjiang region of China. That went into effect in June of 22. And it's significant because it significantly increases customs authority to detain merchandise with any nexus to the region. So, in terms of the impact for the companies are now doing a risk assessment. How likely is it that their shipments will be detained, and spending lots of money in mapping their supply chains. In terms of detention, since June of 22, when the act went into effect, Customs has detained 7,058 shipments. Customs is now publicly posting their data. Those shipments are valued at $2.6 billion, almost half of which has been electronics, and then there's apparel and industrial and manufacturing materials. Interestingly, the countries that the detentions are coming from, Malaysia is in first place, then Vietnam, and then China is actually in third. And as I said, we clearly expect Customs to expand their enforcement beyond certain products and certain regions as well. So now that we're, a year and a half in to UFLPA enforcement, what we've seen is there are now numerous software companies that are tracking both import data and corporate data, and they use these complicated algorithms, which companies can work with these companies as well, but Customs has contracts with these companies, and Customs always had import data. They've always had import data, but now they have the benefit of using the algorithms that these software companies had, and they're seeing corporate structures with overlapping shareholders for big global companies that they never had access to, and they're using that data to target specific companies. So for example, a company may have, a US buyer may have a contract with, let's say, an Indian supplier who may have some sister company in China with some nexus to the region. We've seen detentions with similar scenarios. So companies need to be aware, and again, that speaks to the risk assessment and mapping supply chains. Next slide, please. So we've discussed the need for visibility and transparency into the supply chain. This is the time for companies, as I've said, to look at their supplier agreements, look at the vendor codes of conduct, look at chargeback policies. What is the plan? Should there be a detention? Are companies just going to export if they can immediately and not deal with US Customs, just export to the EU, Canada, or Mexico? Who's going to pay for the goods? Manufacturers will say if they've delivered the merchandise to the US port that they've complied with their part of the deal. Who's going to pay for those goods? What's going to happen to the project if there's a delay? Where are the provisions for non-compliance, failure to deliver? What if the US buyer is supplying merchandise to a customer? What does that do for a project, let's say, or to a retailer? What does that do to their agreement? So all of this needs to be thought out and then spelled out in these agreements and edited to protect the company. Next slide, please. So now that we're into 2024 and we're planning supply chains for 2025, as I said, companies really appreciate that most products, certainly most complex products, their supply chains are to some extent global. And supply chains, we see vulnerabilities. And sometimes it's challenging to get components to where they need to be for manufacturing. And companies may not want to wait 3 weeks for components to get where they need to be or finished products. And sometimes there are shipping delays now too as well. So, and shipping costs have gone up. So companies want more control over, they realize they need more control over their supply chains, and they potentially want at least some of their supply chain closer to where they are. And in the US, we're now talking about this power of proximity. And I would say it's not just a US phenomenon. I met with an Italian company that's now manufacturing in Croatia, and the power of proximity is that reason as well. And I would say in terms of sourcing, there's even a national security component to sourcing, which is interesting, which we really hadn't, I don't think, thought about before. But if we step back for a bit and think pre-pandemic, pre-trade war with China, the US had 40 years where both parties in this country favored globalization and free trade. And then July 2018, we have the trade war with China with the additional tariffs. We see rising labor costs in China. And now we have Biden's trade policy is clearly focused on domestic industrial policy and domestic worker rights. So it definitely has led to a decoupling of sorts between the US and China. Just of sorts, I would say, certainly not extensive, I mean, certainly not complete. And by the way, Trump has mentioned that if he is reelected, he would impose an additional 60% tariffs on all products from China coming into the US. And then we also have the Red Sea situation, which is dangerous, and it certainly has led to increased surcharges. We've seen in some cases up to a 75% increase in costs. And of course, smaller and medium-sized companies are hit harder than larger companies who have these long-term shipping contracts. We've seen delays. We don't know how long the situation is going to be going on, and who knows if consumer prices will rise from this as well. So I would say all of this has led to an interest in regionalization and nearshoring. Mexico has replaced China as the #1 trading partner with the United States. It's the first time in 20 years. Imports from China into the US are down 20% from 2022 to 2023. And so there is this focus on domestic manufacturing, and that's led to also a rise in interest in nearshoring. And I think the climate crisis and the focus on the environment is also part of that. And one final word is, going back to the geopolitical risks, I would say the very stable trading relationship, although sometimes it's a little rocky, there are certain issues that have to be worked out, but the US and Mexico have had a very stable trading relationship, certainly since NAFTA went into effect in the mid-1990s. So there are lots of benefits of production in Mexico. And now I'm going to turn it over to Gabrielle, who's going to speak more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. And thank you, everybody. And just to frame a little bit my talk here, in a context of supply chain disruptions brought about with the pandemic and an economic trade war between the US and China, Mexico is strategically poised to take advantage of the situation. There are a couple, or there are quite a few things that bring us to where we are now. And I'd like to first focus on the structural benefits, which are non-replicable, of why Mexico is strategically poised to take advantage of this nearshoring trend. First of all, it's the location. So we have one of the largest land borders with the largest market in the world, which is the US. It's one of the most frequently crossed borders in the world. It's land trade also in Mexico accounts for some of the busiest commercial borders in the world. So that's definitely a big advantage. In terms of location and shipping costs, those are a bit tied together. Mexico is also not only with the US, but for example, with Europe and Asia, is also connected by sea to with the Atlantic through the Caribbean, to the Gulf of Mexico, and with the Pacific, with important ports on both both coastlines. There is, well, of course, the option of land crossing or shipping through land to the US. The third point here, demography. Mexico is a country of approximately 130 million people, just so you have an idea of size. And more than that, more than half of that are people who are in the workforce. So that's definitely a big plus for a country that's looking, or for a company that's looking to relocate to a country where workforce is available. We'll talk a little bit more on that on the specifics of the workforce available. And as Laura mentioned, since labor costs have been rising in China right now, it's in some cases the same to manufacture. The labor cost is the same in China as in some of the regions in Mexico. So that's definitely also something to keep in mind. And the time zone. Mexico shares 2 of the 3 time zones with the US, so that's also definitely a big plus in terms of when operating a manufacturing operation. Next slide, please. Here, now benefits that are within our control are mainly public policy that's been put in place in Mexico. And one point that I want to emphasize here is these issues or these points that I'm going to talk about right here take time to implement. Most of the time it's bilateral legislative efforts. So as you can imagine, they take quite a few years to materialize. And we have the great advantage that we already have a good set of legal framework already in place to take advantage of this nearshoring trend. For example, Mexico has 15 trade agreements with more than 50 countries, including the US. It has 30 agreements for the protection of foreign investments, 9 commercial agreements, and a global trade framework already in place, which would grant manufacturers manufacturing in Mexico access to 60% of the world's GDP. So, and this is specifically important for the European Union and for the UK. Mexico already has a legal framework in place for the European region. So that's also definitely something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Here, of course, one of our most important free trade agreements is the USMCA, which is a second iteration of the free trade agreement for the North America region. North America, just so we can put it in context, accounts for 30% of the global economy and integrates, as mentioned, one of the largest or the largest market in the world, which is the US, in one single country. And it's also a term that has been coined recently that I particularly like is friendshoring or ally shoring. Laura mentioned a little bit national security. She mentioned some policy that's been in place for forced labor. One of the trends or one of the positive positive things to look at when looking to relocate to a country is a country that has similar policy or that it would be friendly to the country that is receiving as a host. So, for example, Mexico in the context of North America is a good friend, as Laura mentioned, to North America, the rest of North America, and it's also the case with European countries. There's, for example, one of the, or the biggest manufacturing plant Lego has is located in Monterrey, Mexico, which is in the northern part of Mexico. For example, Volkswagen and Audi have also a very big manufacturing plant in the Puebla region, which is in the center of Mexico. Just to name a few examples of countries already operating in Mexico for some time now. Next slide, please. Here, Mexico, just to mention some of the tax treaties that are already in place also with other countries. As you can see, all of Latin America and practically all of Europe is also included in these countries. Just to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Here, in terms of skilled labor, as I mentioned, more than half of our 130 million population is in the workforce. There's also very good higher education institutions in Mexico, some of the top ranking institutions in Latin America, in fact, which are pumping out graduates in STEM field and technicians as well, not just with professional degrees, but also technicians. And this is something I'd also like to emphasize. This is something that also doesn't happen overnight. This is something that has been decades in the making, and it's also something that companies looking to relocate to Mexico have looked at very favorably. The demographic makeup of the country and the skilled workforce and labor costs, obviously. Next slide, please. Here, in terms of tax benefits, there are some policies already in place as well. For example, a specific policy is the EMEX program, which is a program that basically allows for temporary import of supplies to the country to undergo a manufacturing process and to eventually be exported. There are certainly a lot of manufacturers that take advantage of this program, so that's a thing to keep an eye on. And there's also a recent decree from the federal government, which was issued late last year for the benefit of the specific industries mentioned below. For example, this is a clear example. There was a law passed in the US last year as well, the CHIPS Act, to try to bring back semiconductor industry to the US. And this is an example of how the two jurisdictions, Mexico and the US, have coordinated to implement policy which stimulates a specific industry in particular. And without getting into much detail about this decree, it basically allows for several tax benefits for companies involved in these fields. And see above friendshoring and ally shoring. This is a little bit more of what I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. Here, there's also an important export-import ecosystem. As mentioned by Laura, nearshoring is not a new trend in Mexico. At least with the US, we had the first iteration of the free trade agreement with North America in the mid-90s. We've had also since decades ago free trade agreements with the European region, not just with the European Union, but also with the UK particularly. So there's a regional financial ecosystem already in place to satisfy cross-border financing needs, for example. In the private sector, there are fintechs and regional banks that have been stepping up with tailored products for small and medium enterprises and providing supply chain finance in areas underserved by banking institutions. And in the public sector, there are development banks on all sides of on all jurisdictions in place with clear policies to stimulate foreign trade and export-import. For example, in the public sector, there is a development bank in Mexico that specifically works to stimulate trade or to help trade international trade. Next slide, please. Here, and in terms of what to expect in 2024, we're starting to see an expansion from pure manufacturing to higher value-added industries. For example, as large corporations look to relocate to Mexico, they also look to their advisors who have presence in most jurisdictions where they themselves are present. For example, I'm talking about big accounting firms, law firms, and certainly GT is not the exception. GT opened its office in Mexico 10 years, more than 10 years ago, and we are looking at efforts to expand. My relocation to Monterrey and working remotely with the Mexico City office is a specific response to a need we saw of great expansion or great interest in the northern Mexico region for companies to look to profit from this nearshoring trend. Mexico, we're also seeing that it's being reinforced as a gateway to North America and other regions. As I mentioned, it's not just companies looking to export to the US, but also looking to export, for example, to the rest of Latin America, to Asia even. That's certainly something that works to Mexico's favor. And with the bilateral and US-Mexico stimulus efforts, we can expect also the consolidation of supply chain industries for industries such as the automotive and semiconductor sector. See above my comment on the CHIPS Act and the tax benefit for Mexico manufacturers, which was recently put in place. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to you, Laura. Next slide.
Thank you, Gabrielle. So one word on regulatory compliance in the US, particularly for companies that are not situated in the US, and I know this is an international audience today. We have federal regulations, sort of a maze. We have federal regulations which come out of the US Congress, and then we have the states which also enact their own regulations. So for certain products that are imported into the US, it's sometimes difficult for companies to track that maze. So for example, PFAS, the chemical, there are numerous states with their own PFAS regulations now. And that's certainly a moving target that's been expanded as time goes over. Over time, you know, New York and California are the most active. I would say probably California is the most active. But for certain issues, and as I said, for PFAS, for example, there are many, many states now with their own regulations. So companies have to be cognizant of that, and that just adds, you know, a challenge for companies to track, but very important. And again, any state change should be added to supplier agreements as well. Next slide, please. So because we're talking about sourcing strategies and global supply chains and increased tariffs on numerous products, including any product that is manufactured in China, there are certain duty mitigation strategies that companies can employ to reduce their duty exposure upon entry into the US. And first sale is probably the best one, other than using a free trade agreement with the numerous countries, and we just had a plug for USMCA. But other than using a free trade agreement, using first sale, which is a way you structure the transaction between the US buyer and the overseas suppliers, it reduces the cost of the goods, which is what's declared to US Customs, and therefore the duties and the fees on top on the value of the goods is reduced. And it can reduce duties by 10 to 20%, which is quite significant. Next slide, please. So here's a diagram of how it works. So typically the US buyer, the US importer, has a purchase order with a middleman outside the US, a vendor. The vendor can either then be related or unrelated to the factories which actually manufacture the goods. And that middleman can take different shades. It can be an entity, let's say in Hong Kong, that's set up for tax purposes, or Singapore, or it can take sort of different colors to it. But there has to be 3 parties. So the US importer has a purchase order with the middleman would set up a purchase order with the factories, and then the factory issues a purchase order to the middleman, who then issues a purchase order with the importer. So the US importer, let's say their merchandise is $10 a unit, the middleman invoice to the purchase order with the factory would be $8 a unit, and the invoice coming back would be $8 a unit, and that's the invoice that would be submitted to customs. So that would be a savings of $2 a unit, and the duty on $2 a unit. Next slide, please. So, and here's an illustrative example. So instead of $20 a unit, the product becomes $16 a unit, and at 16% duty, it's quite significant. And you add an additional 25% on top of that, it can be quite significant. So there truly can be real savings for companies, because basically what's being shaved off is that middleman profit, right? You still need to pay duty on the value of the components, any assists that go into it, the labor that goes into producing the good, but not on profit. Next slide, please. And here are just some legal prerequisites for using first sale. As I said, you need 3 legal entities, 2 sales. The goods have to be clearly destined for the United States. And again, the parties can be related or unrelated. Their transaction just has to be, and there's due diligence that's required on the part of the company, and they just need to show that the transaction is at arm's length. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're ready for questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Laura. And before we move to the Q&A section, I just wanted to say thank you very much, Gabrielle, Laura, for that presentation. Incredibly informative, and what I think is an incredibly important topic as well. So thank you very much for that. And I will say to our audience, if you do have a question, please do send it in via the chat function. We have a number of questions here to get through, so I'll jump right in. The first question for you, Laura: do you foresee new protective tariffs being issued in the upcoming year for China and other Asian countries?
So I don't see Biden taking off the current tariffs with China, certainly not before the election. That would be seen as weak on China, and I don't think that's going to happen. And as I said, if Trump gets elected, he has said he would impose 60% additional tariffs on all products coming from China. What I think the change that we actually may see is with regard to e-commerce. And currently there's a provision, and this provision has been in effect in the United States for a very long time, that shipments valued under a certain dollar amount there are no duties, they're informal shipments, A, and B, there are no duties attached to it. And currently that dollar amount is $800. So companies that use e-commerce, and not just small company or smaller companies that are selling on Amazon, but larger companies as well, are setting up, setting up a structure so that they have set up, and they use a structure so that they can take advantage of this $800 shipment. And Congress is very, very focused on this issue. They think there's a lot of fraud. Congress and Customs, they think there's a lot of fraud with these shipments. And there's also a concern about forced labor. There's no way to track forced labor or the other issues that are of import to US Customs on these informal shipments. So there are currently a lot of proposals in Congress to change this system. I've seen the dollar amount go from, currently it's at 800, going down to even $50 a shipment, right? So you couldn't buy, a European, or an individual couldn't buy a European suit and import it into the US and not pay duty anymore, you know, at $50. Other proposals are limited to change it just to impact goods coming from China. Other proposals are global, and other proposals are product specific. Apparel in particular has been targeted in that with that. So I don't think there are going to be additional tariffs on products coming from Asia, but or China and the rest of Asia, but I think that we will see some change to e-commerce.
Brilliant, thank you, Laura. And another question for yourself, Laura, but Gabrielle, if you do have any thoughts, please do let us know. What provisions should be included in company contracts to be in compliance with US federal and state regulations?
Yeah, so as I said, I mean, it's a maze, and there are, you know, it's a maze of regulations between federal and state. So companies really need to do that risk assessment and see where are they vulnerable. You know, for example, I mentioned PFAS, the chemical, right? And that chemical was used for many, many years in making products water resistant. As I said, there are lots of states with PFAS regulations, and now the Environmental Protection Agency, the US federal agency, you know, the Environmental Protection Agency recently came out with a regulation as well for a report due for any company that had PFAS in their supply chain in the last 11 years. So numerous companies, because it's a dangerous chemical, numerous companies have taken PFAS out of their supply chains. But going back 11 years, and now these companies have to submit a report in a year. So it's companies need to track these and then add, you know, edit their agreements so that their suppliers, if they need information from their suppliers, they will, you know, be compliant and send them what they need.
Excellent, thank you, Laura. Gabrielle, this is a question for you, a very interesting question, I think. Are there any specific benefits or stimulus efforts for European companies investing in Mexico?
Sorry, I was muted there. Thank you for the question. Yes, I know specifically there are trade agreements in place that benefit European inbound investment in Mexico. Generally, the benefits are in the form of depreciation or accelerated depreciation in several expenses or not expenses, investments. I know investment also in Mexico in manufacturing facilities in Mexico and capital expenditures are also there are. I'd have to turn to the tax practice to give us specifics on the trade agreements, but I know from matters we've advised on along with the tax practice that there are benefits of repatriating profits for investments and several expenses made here in Mexico specifically for European companies operating here in Mexico.
Brilliant, thank you, Gabrielle. Brooke has asked, do you have any insight on aluminium extrusion, ADD, CVD scope? Do you have any timelines on that?
Yeah, so the aluminum extrusion case is ongoing, the dumping case. And in terms of timelines, the timelines are highly prescripted by the Department of Commerce and the International Trade Commission. So I don't know when the next filing is due, but if the person writes to me, I can let them know. I mean, it's a published date. So there's no guesswork there. It's a published date.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Laura. The final question that I can see that we've had in from our audience is directed at David. If you do have any questions, though, please do send them in. And indeed, if you think of a question after this presentation, you can see the contact information for Gabrielle and Laura on your screen at the moment. So please do get in touch. We do really encourage you to get in touch. This question, David, from David, with Mexican presidential elections in June, do you see any changes in policy that would relate to free trade and other supply chain factors?
Thanks for the question, David. Well, not to my knowledge. At least there are two top or front runners in the Mexican presidential elections right now, and I think probably one of the few issues that both of them can agree on is the benefits that the nearshoring trend and foreign investment has brought to Mexico. So at least on their platforms, they haven't mentioned that they would immediately change or do substantial changes, implement substantial policy changes to free trade. And this also responds to another trend we've been seeing lately. Foreign trade from Mexico lately has been from a host of several countries, not just the US or China. As I mentioned, there are some very good examples of big European companies already manufacturing or that have set up shop here in Mexico since decades ago. So that's looked at favorably on both ends of the political spectrum.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gabriel. So just to finish off, I always like to ask our presenters, if you could just give us, if there's anything that you would like our audience to leave today with, perhaps one or two key points that you think our audience should be leaving today's session with, that would be brilliant. Laura, perhaps I can start with you.
Sure. So, considering geopolitical risks, sourcing strategies, companies have to think about what's important to the company and where their risk is, and then implement that with a strategy, in terms of where they're sourcing and their agreements to protect the company.
Brilliant, thanks. And Gabriel, if you have any closing thoughts or comments.
Sure. I mean, I'd like just to echo a little bit of what I mentioned earlier. Free trade and integration is not a new trend. I think it's come. We've seen it, at least in Mexico, in waves. There's already, as I mentioned, a lot of groundwork that has already been done. There are a lot of benefits of relocating to Mexico, fortunately. So I just like the audience to leave with an idea that Mexico is a jurisdiction that has a lot of benefits in place to favor manufacturing and relocating to Mexico. And a clear example of that is the numerous companies that have already decided to do so, and the good experience they've had operating here in Mexico for quite some time now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gabriel. So I think that we will wrap up a few minutes early then, but to conclude, as I say, if you do have any questions that come to you after this session, you have the contact information for Laura and Gabriel in front of you. And indeed, we will be following up with all of you with a copy of the recording and the slides and the contact information of the firm. So please do get in touch. Laura, Gabriel, thank you so much for your time and your insights and thoughts today. It was a fascinating session. We would love to have you back again for another one of these and have your thoughts and insights again. To our audience, thank you very much for being with us today. We really do appreciate it. I wish you all a lovely rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.